Shackles and Secrets, the prisoner who escaped America's toughest lockdown, the island of no return. If you think no one can escape the unescapable, think again. Subscribe before they seal this story away forever. San Francisco Bay, June 1962. The night was wet, cold, and alive with the hum of waves slapping against stone. Out there, barely a mile from the glittering mainland, stood a fortress built to crush the spirit of even the toughest men, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. They called it the Rock. The world's most secure prison. The place where the country's worst criminals were sent to disappear, forever. Inside those walls, everything was regimented, the clang of metal doors, the shuffle of boots on concrete, the echo of keys in the dark. The guards believed there was no way out, not through the walls, not across the freezing waters, not alive. But three men, Frank Morris, and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, refused to believe that. Frank Morris was the mind. Quiet, sharp-eyed, always watching. He'd been in and out of prison since he was 13, and every time, he found a way out. The Anglin brothers were craftsmen, farm boys from Florida who'd grown up working with their hands, calm and loyal but hardened by years behind bars. What brought them together wasn't friendship. It was obsession, the shared belief that no prison was truly escape-proof. Frank had been studying Alcatraz for months, the guard rotations, the tool access points, even the rhythm of the tides. The guards thought he was harmless, just another inmate who kept to himself. But behind his blank stare, a plan was taking shape, a plan so daring, it bordered on insanity. It began with a spoon. Then, a piece of sandpaper. Then, a stolen motor from a prison vacuum cleaner. Every night, while the rest of the cell block slept, Frank and the Anglin brothers worked silently in the dark. They chipped at the crumbling concrete around their cell vents using homemade tools crafted from spoons and discarded saw blades. They hid the noise with music, a harmonica, softly played. They disguised the damage with cardboard and paint. Every move was measured, every risk calculated. And when exhaustion threatened to expose them, they remembered the bay, the icy, black water that had swallowed countless escapees before them. Men who'd drowned, frozen, or vanished. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison, it was a warning. But these men weren't afraid to die. By spring of 1962, they had built something the guards couldn't have imagined. From stolen raincoats and glue made from soap and toothpaste, they crafted a makeshift raft and life vests. The Anglins, experienced swimmers, had tested small patches of material in the sink. If it held air for 24 hours, it passed. But there was still the problem of time, how to fool the guards during bed checks. That's when they built the heads. Using soap, toilet paper, paint, and hair stolen from the prison barbershop, they sculpted lifelike dummies, with real eyelashes, freckles, and even tiny cracks in the plaster to mimic human skin. They placed them on their pillows, tucked under blankets, positioned just right. Each dummy would stare lifelessly into the dark, breathing nothing but silence, while the real men crawled through the vents and into the walls. On June 11, 1962, the weather was perfect for an escape, cold, dark, and fog-thick. The guards didn't know it, but by the time they performed their midnight check, three men were already gone. They had slipped through the holes behind their cells, climbed up an unused utility corridor, and reached the roof. There, in the pounding rain, they dragged their homemade raft to the edge of the building. Down below, the black water of San Francisco Bay waited, 48 degrees, with currents strong enough to break bones. No one in their right mind would have jumped. But they weren't in their right minds anymore. They were desperate, driven by something deeper than freedom, the need to prove the impossible was possible. They inflated their raft with a concertina, a small prison accordion-turned air pump, and launched it into the waves. The fog swallowed them whole. Hours later, the guards noticed something strange during roll call. Three men didn't move. They didn't respond to their names. When one guard finally reached the cells, he shouted, "Morris! Wake up," and tapped the head on the pillow. It rolled off, and shattered on the floor. Inside was nothing but soap and paper. The alarm bells rang through the night. The lights blazed across the island. Helicopters cut through the fog. Every officer knew what it meant: someone had done the impossible. The Coast Guard scoured the bay for days. They found pieces of a raincoat, fragments of wood, but no bodies. The FBI called it an escape attempt that almost succeeded. Almost. But the truth was murkier than the water that swallowed them. Because days later, a report came from a cargo ship passing under the Golden Gate Bridge, a flicker of light on the water, the faint sound of something like a paddle. And when the current shifted, something else surfaced, something no one could explain. A piece of the raft, torn and deflated. And a single photograph, faded, wet, but unmistakable. It showed two men, smiling, the manhunt and the myth. The sirens never stopped. For 3 days, the island screamed. Boats, helicopters, and searchlights turned the dark waters of San Francisco Bay into a theater of panic and disbelief. 3 men, gone without a trace. The warden of Alcatraz was furious. "No one escapes my island," he growled to the reporters crowding the dock. His jaw was tight, his pride shattered. But deep down, even he knew, this wasn't a simple jailbreak. This was a message. The FBI, U.S. Marshals, Coast Guard, and even Navy divers were called in. For a week straight, they scoured every inch of the bay. They dragged the water with nets, circled the shoreline, and searched every nearby island, Angel Island, Marin Headlands, even the beaches across from San Francisco. All they found was debris. A paddle made from scrap wood. Shreds of rubber from the homemade raft. And a small waterproof bag filled with photographs, one of the Anglin brothers as children, smiling in black and white. But no bodies. The water around Alcatraz was merciless, 48 degrees, with deadly rip currents strong enough to drag a man under in minutes. The Bureau announced that the men had drowned, their bodies pulled into the Pacific Ocean. Case closed. But not everyone believed that. Inside the prison, guards whispered about the vent shafts, how they were widened with precision, how the dummies were so realistic they fooled officers for hours. It wasn't luck. It was planning. The kind of planning that doesn't end at the water's edge. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wanted the story buried. He knew the legend of the unescapable Alcatraz was built on fear, and this escape had just cracked it. So, the official record was written clean and simple: the prisoners drowned in the attempt. But outside the prison walls, the myth began to grow. A fisherman claimed he saw something strange near the Marin shoreline that same night, 3 figures crawling out of the water, dragging something behind them. The FBI dismissed it as mistaken identity. Then came the letter. In December 1962, 6 months after the escape, a handwritten letter arrived at the San Francisco FBI field office. It read, "We made it. We're safe. The bay was cold, but not enough to kill us. Stop looking." The letter had no signature. The ink was smudged, the handwriting shaky. The Bureau declared it a hoax. But the file stayed open, just in case. Meanwhile, Frank Morris's mother began receiving Christmas cards. No return address. No notes inside, just blank cards signed, "Your boy." The Anglin family received the same. Coincidence? Maybe. But the timing was too perfect. Every year, one new card. Every year, silence from the authorities. As the years passed, Alcatraz itself began to crumble. In 1963, less than a year after the escape, the government shut it down for good. The official reason? High maintenance costs. But the guards knew the truth: the prison's legend was broken. No one wanted to believe that 3 ordinary men outsmarted the most fortified prison in America. Yet evidence kept surfacing, small and strange. In 1979, the case was briefly reopened after a set of photographs appeared in Brazil. 2 men, middle-aged, wearing sunglasses and standing beside a farm truck. Locals swore they were Americans, quiet, polite, paid in cash. When the photos were sent to the FBI for analysis, the results were chilling. Facial recognition confirmed a 98% match to the Anglin brothers. Still, the Bureau refused to comment. Over the decades, retired marshals kept chasing leads. One agent, Art Roderick, dedicated his career to finding the truth. He visited the Anglin family in Florida and found hidden letters, old maps, and a painting, a rough sketch of three men on a raft under the moon. But one item stood out most, a handmade Christmas card postmarked 1963, 1 year after the escape. Inside, scrawled in fading ink, were the words, "To Mother, from John. Merry Christmas. Love you always." The handwriting matched perfectly. By then, the case had already entered folklore. Books, documentaries, and films retold the story, each adding a layer of mystery. Some believed they drowned that night, dragged down by the current, their bodies never recovered. Others swore they survived, slipping into South America, living under new names. In 2013, over 50 years after the escape, another letter arrived at a San Francisco police station. This time, the writer claimed to be John Anglin. It read, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. If you announce on TV that I'll be guaranteed medical help and no more than a year in jail, I'll tell you exactly where I am." This is no joke. The FBI tested the letter for fingerprints and DNA. The result, inconclusive. But the tone, the details, the handwriting, felt real. Even decades later, the mystery still burned like a cold flame. Did they die in the water that night? Or did they become ghosts, walking the earth under new names, hiding in plain sight? In 2018, a History Channel investigation recreated the escape using the same tools and timing. The results stunned experts. According to tide maps from that exact night, the current would have pushed the raft directly toward Angel Island, not out to sea. Meaning survival wasn't just possible. It was likely. The truth had been staring everyone in the face for decades, buried beneath bureaucracy, pride, and fear. Because if Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers did survive, it meant the government's greatest prison was never escape-proof. And somewhere, perhaps on a quiet farm in Brazil, three old men might have been watching the news, smiling at their legend, Ghosts of the Rock. 50 years had passed since that stormy night in 1962. Alcatraz was now a museum, its corridors echoing not with chains and shouts, but with the footsteps of tourists. Flashlights clicked where guards once patrolled, and the cells that once held the world's most dangerous men now held only silence. But for the men and women who had worked the case, the marshals, the FBI agents, the guards, there was one ghost that never rested. The escape of Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, it was never solved. The U.S. Marshals Service still keeps it open, a tradition they follow until every fugitive turns 99. And as the years rolled on, new evidence began to surface, little fragments that refused to die, just like the legend itself. In 2013, a journalist uncovered the shocking Brazil photograph. It had been taken in 1975, showing two older men standing beside a pickup truck in front of a farm. Their posture, jawline, and eyes bore a near-perfect resemblance to the Anglin brothers. A facial analysis confirmed it, a 99.7% match. The photo had allegedly been sent anonymously to the Anglin family decades earlier, along with a note. They made it. Tell no one. But the most haunting revelation came not from photos or letters, it came from the FBI's own science. When investigators reanalyzed tidal data from June 11, 1962, using modern software, the results contradicted everything the Bureau had claimed for years. At 11:30 p.m., when the inmates launched their raft, the outgoing tide would have pushed them not out to the Pacific Ocean, but directly toward Angel Island, just over a mile north of Alcatraz. If they paddled with the current, they could have reached land within an hour. And that wasn't the only mystery the island held. In 2015, ground-penetrating radar was used at the site of an old farmhouse on Angel Island. Beneath decades of soil and brush, the radar revealed something metallic, shaped like a raft valve and rusted beyond recognition. The technology couldn't prove it was theirs, but it couldn't disprove it either. By now, Frank Morris would have been 90 years old. The Anglin brothers, a few years younger. The marshals tracking them were retired or dead, yet the files still sat in the archives, labeled, "Open Investigation, Status, Unknown." And then came the letter. The one that changed everything. In 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a handwritten envelope with no return address. Inside was a confession, trembling, uneven, and written by a hand that had seen too many years. "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. Yes, we made it that night, but barely. The water was freezing, and the waves were stronger than we thought. Frank didn't make it. He drowned before we reached land. Clarence and I survived, but we split up later. I've lived a quiet life. I have cancer now. If you can promise me medical care, I'll tell you everything before I die." The FBI ran DNA, fingerprints, handwriting. The results came back inconclusive. Not fake. Not proven. Just possible. For the Marshals Service, that was enough to keep the case open. Decades later, retired Agent Art Roderick, who had studied the case for most of his career, stood on the shore facing Alcatraz. He said, "You can feel it, this place never lets go of its secrets." He pointed toward the dark outline of Angel Island. "If they made it, they'd have hit there. It's not impossible. It's exactly what Frank would have planned." Forensics experts later examined the dummy heads created by the escapees, still preserved in evidence. Each hair was real. Each face hand-painted with subtle detail. One had even been weighted to mimic breathing. It wasn't a sloppy attempt. It was professional. Ingenious. And then, in one final twist, an anonymous tip from Brazil surfaced again in 2020. The caller, an elderly man, claimed to have worked with two quiet American brothers in the 1980s who kept to themselves, paid in cash, and never spoke about their past. He remembered one thing clearly: one of them always wore a faded tattoo of an eagle on his forearm. The same tattoo Clarence Anglin had in prison. Investigators never found those men. But the description matched. The timeline fit. The myth lived on. Today, visitors to Alcatraz still stop by cell block B, where the escape began. They peer into the small, jagged holes carved by spoons, the cracks in the concrete that once led to freedom. Behind those bars, they imagine the sound of the harmonica, the faint scrape of metal against stone, and the quiet determination of three men who refused to accept their fate. Maybe they drowned. Maybe they didn't. But one thing is certain: their story survived. Every time fog rolls across the bay, covering the island in a cold gray silence, locals swear they can see it, a shadow on the water, something like a raft drifting just beyond reach. Maybe it's a trick of the tide. Or maybe it's three ghosts who finally found their freedom. Because Alcatraz was never just a prison, it was a promise. And those who escaped it became something larger than life, something untouchable. The rock still stands. But the men who broke it might still be out there. If you think this story was intense, wait until you hear the next one. Subscribe, because the truth is never as locked up as it seems.